Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Rick Spence, thank you for joining me today. I've been listening to quite a bit of your work, and you're such an amazing storyteller, and you've spent so much of your life learning about history. And today I'd like to just explore some of the stuff that you've been learning over the years. And seems like you've really focused in on secret societies, cults, and I think it's one of those subjects that a lot of people are curious about but don't know a lot about. So I think it's going to be fun to try to bridge that gap a little bit for the average person that's going to hear this.
Okay.
Yeah. First of all, I'm just curious how you got down the rabbit hole of studying this particular field. I know history in general, but in particular cults and secret societies.
How did I get into cults and occultism and secret societies and all that type of stuff? It's not that you go looking for it, it just finds you. But the other way I put it is that one thing leads you to another. So you jump down this rabbit hole, and then pretty soon you find out that you're in another one. So, my academic training really started out in the modern Russian history and Eastern European history, which gets you into a lot of, communal violence. Okay, there's a fair amount of that there. Still is. And that then gets you into, if you look at modern Russian history, what's the main thing you're looking at? What looms larger than anything else? The revolutions of 1917. So the minute you get into revolutions, you get into politics, you get into all sorts of conspiratorial skullduggery. Because, as I would always want to point out to students, you can't make a revolution without conspiracy. It just doesn't work any other way. Otherwise, you'll be dead before lunch. So it requires that kind of element. And, once you get into people engaging in conspiratorial skullduggery, then all kinds of other things come in. There's the issues of how these people connect. How do you keep things secret? Well, one of the ways you can keep political conspiracy secret is to hide it within something else, within something that appears to be legal and acceptable. I don't know, like a Masonic lodge. Okay, there you go. And it's exceptional. It's not necessarily arguing in something which is inherent to Freemasonry, but the lodges are there, the people are in them, and sometimes once the lodge meeting is over, you can get around to doing other things like plotting to overthrow the government. Those can be two separate things, but both exist within the same group of people. And it was really the first book I ever wrote was on an obscure Russian revolutionary figure, not Lenin, not Trotsky, not Stalin, a guy named Boris Savinkov. And one of the reasons that I was interested in him is that back in those days, back in the 1917 and pre-1917 period, he was a big cheese in the Russian revolutionary firmament. He was a significant figure. But then he just became kind of edited out of subsequent history. You're going across these little mentions of him, almost always negative. This was the thing I found, that nobody really had anything good to say about him later. So I was just intrigued by that. I mean, that's the type of thing. I mean, part of the reasons you get led into stuff is that your curiosity is piqued by certain things. So I was interested as to why this guy, who was a significant figure early on, and who might well, under different circumstances, had played the role of a Lenin or Trotsky later on, but never did. How did this guy get written out of Russian history? And so I just began to dig into him, and that's really where I first came across the sort of underworld of secret society associations. And the way that happened is that Savinkov, in the aftermath of the First Revolution, it was a kind of, there's this thing called the provisional government in Russian history, which is the thing between the fall of the Tsar and Lenin and the Bolsheviks taking over. It's actually the regime that Lenin overthrew. Lenin has nothing to do with overthrowing the Tsar. That was all accomplished by other folks. And so Savinkov was deputy minister of war. He was arguably the second most powerful person in that regime for a brief period of time. So at one part, he's the commandant or the commissar of this town, and living in this town is a member of the Romanov family, the imperial family, one of the Grand Dukes. And I'll just simplify the story. The Grand Duke is sort of trapped in the town, and given that he's a Romanov, doesn't feel particularly safe there. So he goes to Savinkov as the commandant of the town and asks him to let him, the Grand Duke, and his family leave. In other words, to let them escape. And these are two men who politically have nothing in common. Savinkov is a revolutionary. In fact, in his early career, he'd been a revolutionary terrorist. He had conspired with other revolutionaries to assassinate this other man's relatives.
Hmm.
And so they have nothing in common in that sense, but the Grand Duke appeals to him on the basis that we are both Masonic brothers. And I ask you, as a fellow Freemason, that's just the appeal I make. I know that politically we're completely at odds, but we share this thing in common, and I'm asking you, as a brother Mason, to grant me this favor for myself and my family. And Savinkov does. And honestly, I'd never run across that before. I'd never seen how that works. And it doesn't mean that that works in every case, but it worked in that case. And that then made me pay attention to the affiliations of people. And I began to pay close attention to the people who were affiliated with lodges and how they were. And then you began to see that that beneath all of this political factionalism, there's this whole kind of Masonic undercurrent. And the other interesting thing is that Freemasonry in revolutionary Russia wasn't a big deal. I mean, there weren't a lot of them. We're talking about You're talking about an empire at that time with a total population of around 170 to 180 million people. Out of that 170 million, let's say, how many Freemasons were there? Maybe a couple of thousand at most, maybe only several hundred. And it really sort of, they fell into different groups. And you were particularly talking a group that were called political Freemasons. These were mostly people. And who were these people? Well, they were political figures. They were leaders of political parties. They were captains of industry. So to the extent that Tsarist Russia had a Wall Street, well, most of the major figures there were also members of lodges. They were generals. They were members of the Romanov family, just like the Grand Duke that I mentioned. So while these people weren't numerous, they really coalesced into the upper echelons of Russian imperial society. And you also found them you found Freemasons among the revolutionaries, you found them among the counter-revolutionaries, you found them among the police, among the imperial family, the captains of industry, the heads of political parties. And while certainly they all didn't get along and they plotted against each other and betrayed each other, they sometimes cooperated on that basis. So once you notice one secret society, you then start noticing whether or not there are other ones and how those fit together. And I think it's important. I think historically, secret societies, by which I mean selective, oath bound orders. So the thing about them, particularly about Freemasonry, is its existence isn't a secret. Everybody knows about it. I mean, hell, they advertise. And they always did. There was nothing that was secret. What is secret is what goes on within the once you get into it, you're repeatedly sworn to secrecy about the secrets that which may or may not actually exist.
Hmm.
It's one of those things that, as it was explained to me once by a Freemason, an American one, whatever that's worth, he goes, the whole thing about all these oaths of secrecy and the horrible things that will happen to if you betray them is that, yeah, no, nobody's going to kill you. I mean, that's not going to happen. But it's a test of character. So you've been chosen to be part of the order, and that's the key thing in what I call a secret society. You must be chosen.
Hmm.
You can't just apply for membership and everybody gets accepted. There's nothing democratic about the process. It is we like you or we don't like you. And we don't have to really explain why. But once you are admitted, you then have to commit to the organization. And these oaths of secrecy are a commitment to now your brothers in this organization. And if you betray the oaths, you're just basically showing that you were you're a bad brother. You have betrayed your personal honor by doing that. So it's a test of character, which doesn't mean that in certain places at certain times you might have had people who took those oaths much more seriously, but that just depends upon what you want to do with it. And so I began to pay attention as to how these organizations operated. And the other thing that begins to bring you that then I found there was a kind of crossover between that and the world of espionage. Because the other thing that I kind of separately developed an interest in were spies. And so I'm always looking for spies. And you can find them in some interesting places.
Hmm.
And then I noticed there was a connection with that. And then you begin to notice the overlap between intelligence and secret societies and outright occultism, which is the practice of some kind of esoteric belief system, which let's say is a little bit outside the range of what might be called normal religious practice.
I'm curious about the word conspiracy because I've heard you define it in a way that I'd never heard, and I liked it. So I'd love for you to do that again once I ask this question. I'm curious. Once these Freemasons and these secret societies, what is the underlying methodology that they organize themselves from? Like, how do they? There's no leader in them, right? They just sort of self-organize, or what are the rules and the ways that they actually develop into these structures? It just seems like there's got to be an architect at the beginning.
Well, let's take Freemasonry as the most obvious example because it became starting in the 18th century and continuing to today. It's still one of the largest, most universalized oath-bound fraternal orders in the world, and everybody else copied it. I mean, the huge number of things were just rip-offs of Freemasonry because look, they've got this whole thing. So you can add the number of levels, you can give it different names, you can change the different oaths of secrecy, but it's all the same thing. It's just copying Freemasonry. So they had a fairly good template. So the thing about Freemasonry is that there is no central organization. There never was. And one of the ways I've described it is Freemasonry is a house of many rooms. It's a thing, but within it, it's compartmentalized in many different ways. So there are lots of generalizations about Freemasonry. The biggest, generally true generalization is that it's a boys' club. It's a it's a fraternal organization. No girls allowed, except when they are, because from the get-go, I mean, you can go all the way back to the period where Freemasonry becomes a big deal in the Enlightenment, the 18th century, and even then, there were a few, not many, but there were a few lodges that did admit women. And that continued into the 19th and 20th centuries. And there's a term for it, co-masonry. So if you run across something, if there's a co-Masonic lodge, that is a lodge which other lodges wouldn't recognize as actually being legitimate Freemasonry that admits women. But those are rare exceptions. Generally speaking, as a male, you had to be 21 to be admitted, but there were exceptions to that. I've seen people who were 18, I've seen people who were 16 who were admitted into lodges because those lodges just decided to operate that way. So you've generally got individual lodges, each of which is practically speaking independent because each lodge selects its own members. No one assigns people to you. They're above the lodges. You have grand lodges. You have these kind of larger orders that to some degree try to regularize ritual and practice among the lodges that are part of that grand lodge, but they only have authority over those. And excuse me, and that authority is very limited. I mean, basically, as long as you keep cool about it and quiet about it, a lodge can get away with doing pretty much anything that it wants to. There's no grand inquisitors that show up to check whether or not you're doing these kinds of processes. Which means that while most of the time what goes on in the lodge simply follows normal, accepted, approved practice, there's nothing odd. It certainly is relatively easy given the predilections of people within that lodge, that things can get weird pretty quickly if you want them to. Because remember, what you're doing is that you have a group of people that then selectively recruits other people. And what you're generally going to do in that case, I mean, the general idea is that, well, within our lodge, we want to have diversity. So we try to pick people with different opinions and so on. And I think that's mostly talk, because what practically happens is that like-minded people associate with other like-minded people. So you don't actually want to bring someone into the lodge who could create problems. And remember, everybody has to agree on it. That at least is the tradition. There are exceptions to that as well, but the tradition is that everyone in the lodge, all current members, have to agree upon the admission of a new member, which is where we get the term blackball. The idea is it would go around, and we're going to admit this person is a brother, and everybody had a black marble and a white marble, and the can went around, and you dropped one into the can. And if at the time the can got back, there was even one black ball in it, that person was not admitted. Everyone has to agree.
Mm.
So it's very easy in those circumstances to create an oath-bound group of like-minded men who can then put that like-mindedness to different practice. And so there's nothing, Masonic lodges have a very vague past. Okay, so you get all these stories that, the one that a lot of Freemasons embrace, sort of. I mean, some take it seriously, some take it as a kind of nice story, is that they're all descended from the Knights Templar. That could be true, but the historical reality is that there is no document of any kind. There is no paper trail that connects Freemasonry to the Templars. That was something that, for one reason or another, many Masons beginning in the 18th century began to believe,
Hmm.
and that belief has persisted. I mean, the best example I could give you of that is that I think it's around 1905, okay, in the early 20th century, American Freemasons, who were very, very numerous, millions of them at that point, decided to create a boys' auxiliary, the type of thing that their sons could join, preparing them to follow their dads into Masonry. And what did they call that? What are we going to call this boys' auxiliary? Oh, the Demolays. You may know someone who was in the Demolays. And who's that? Well, that's Jacques de Molay. And Jacques de Molay was the last martyred Grand Master of the Templar Order. Man who was burned at the stake as an apostate and heretic in 1314. Now, that was done, I don't think at random. It was done because American Freemasons in the early 20th century looked back at the Templars and Demolay and recognized him, saw in him, realistically or not, as a kind of martyr, as an admirable figure that they would centuries later name their boys' auxiliary after. So that's part of this whole kind of Templar myth
Mm.
that pervades Freemasonry. But it's a myth. It was a myth that was accepted. It's not a documentable fact, but it's certainly what people believe. And once people get an idea in their head, then there's no convincing them that it's not there. Um, so I think what that's indicative of, in a way, is a couple of trends. I mean, why would the Templars be seen as sort of admirable ancestors? Where did that idea ever come from to begin with? And there again, you need to go back to the 18th century. Now, I should say that Masonic lodges, that is, oath-bound associations of people who called themselves Freemasons, which meant someone who was trained. What that technically meant was that you were trained in masonry. You could build things. And you were then free to travel around and work in different places, a kind of journeyman. And the difference, of course, in Masonic lodges, we think of Freemasons, is that virtually nobody in there is actually a Mason. That's not what they do. Okay, they don't get together to build things. Okay, they don't have a lodge meeting and then we all go, we get a bunch of sugar cubes and work on our model cathedral. No, that, with rare exception, it would only be in sheer luck that you'd find anybody who was a Freemason who was actually a Mason. I have run across those. So, beginning around 1400, not in 1300, but about 100 years after the Templars disappear, you get these kind of these documents that appear to be sort of the constitutions or regulations of what were called speculative Masonic lodges. And they were speculative as opposed to operative, because operative actually meant an association of real Masons. Speculative Masons are people who just pretend to be Masons. And you can still look at Masonic regalia. I mean, they got aprons and trowels and squares and compasses. They got all these tools that Masons actually use. But in Freemasonry, those are ritual items. They're not actually used for any practical work. So what you've got in Freemasonry are a group of people who get together who aren't Masons, who play at being Masons. It becomes this kind of cover behind which it operates. And the other thing about them is that they're generally fairly well-to-do. So Freemasonry never was the secret society of the poor. I mean, heaven, no, the poor are not there. Okay, farmers, peasants, working, actual Masons, people who worked with their hands, were rarely to be found within lodges because from the beginning, membership was expensive. You can get hold of modern catalogs of Masonic regalia and look at how much that stuff costs, and you're expected to pay for all of this. And there's a reason for that. It keeps out the riffraff. If you make the cost of membership high enough, most people simply wouldn't be able to afford to be it. So what are the things, this is why Masonry became so popular in the modern era, why it began to be popular in the 1700s, and it attracted people, generally people of some education, but mostly men of wealth and influence, people from the professions and from business. That's what it's full of. So if you went, in 1900, if you went to an average American town and you went into the Masonic Lodge and you looked at the membership, it would overwhelmingly be doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. Maybe a few landowners, but it would be people of sort of wealth and property. If a Marxist was looking at it, they would argue that Freemasonry was a thoroughly bourgeois organization. And that was, again, there were exceptions to that, but that was generally true. So it became a kind of badge of admittance to the middle class, of the kind of, the local gentry in some way, as close as you could get to that in, you know, Nebraska. That being a member of the Masonic Lodge gave you a certain amount of social credibility. But why would these guys pick a person who was burned at the stake for heresy and apostasy? Well, as these lodges developed, and we don't really know how, over this 300 years before they become this big deal, they really begin to grow and spread, is that there were two currents that were common, not universal, but common in these lodges. And one was anti-monarchy, and the other was anti-clericalism, that is, opposition to the church. They tended to oppose the traditional authority of the crown and the church. Now, if you go back and look at Jacques de Molay and the martyrdom of the Templars, who did that? I mean, who effectively organized a conspiracy against the Templars and destroyed the orders and burned their leader at the stake? Well, there were two main sources in that. The first was the King of France, Philip IV. He's the guy who's really behind the whole thing, the monarchy. And the other, of course, the ones whose approval they had to get, was the Pope, the Catholic Church. So by the time you get to the 18th century, the period of the French Revolution, there were variances, but within French Freemasonry in particular, it became the embodiment of those people who hated two things: the crown and the church. I would point you to one particular figure, the French philosopher Voltaire, a Freemason. And one of the things that attracted him to that order was that he hated the crown and the church. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody else did, but Voltaire might have been an extreme example, but he wanted to hang the king with the guts of the last priest, to paraphrase one of the things he came up with. He despised both of them. And for people who dislike, look at the current in the American Republic. Man, there was a lot more going on in the American Revolution than Freemasonry, but they were there in appreciable numbers. George Washington was one. Thomas Jefferson was almost certainly one. Benjamin Franklin was one. You can go on and on. And so what did we have there? You had the establishment of a republic which repudiated the British monarchy. So those were two currents. Again, not everyone held this, but two currents that tended to find their way into Freemasonry were anti-monarchy, a kind of republicanism, and an anti-clericalism. They tended to oppose the crown and the church. And that's why, I can't give me another reason, why American Freemasons at the beginning of the 20th century would name their boys auxiliary after, as they saw it, the martyred last Grand Master of the Templars. It may be nothing but myth, it may have no basis in reality, but they created a reality out of it. That was the kind of links they made for themselves. So one of the things that you'd mentioned earlier was, what goes on in the kind of realm of conspiracy? How do people conspire about things? What is that exactly? So usually, if you mention conspiracy, you get a couple of reactions. A common one is that it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as conspiracy. There's just conspiracy theories. I mean, apparently, and nothing could be more wrong. Conspiracy just happens. You do it every day, probably without the basis, without even realizing it. Because when you break it down, when you actually define what you're talking about, which is, I think, one of the problems in a lot of discourse, because that's not what people do. They use terms that they don't know what they mean, or they don't even actually have a meaning for them. But conspiracy is roughly defined as, in law, you basically define it as two or more people working together in secret to accomplish some kind of criminal end. But it doesn't have to be that. Nobody ever said that there has to be anything criminal about it. So the actual definition is basically this. It's two or more. You have to have two. Can't conspire by yourself. That's, that's a mental illness, I guess. We have to have two or more people working together in secret. This has to be hidden. You're not doing it openly. That's what makes it conspiratorial. To achieve a common end. That's all it is. And once you see it for what it is, once you've defined it that way, well, I mean, where doesn't that occur? Now, I think it was the economic philosopher Adam Smith, granddaddy of capitalism, who also said, again to paraphrase, that never do two businessmen sit down to a lunch, then it doesn't turn into a conspiracy against the public. That is, they're going to, if you get a group of businessmen who get together, you create an economic cartel. You all agree that we're going to quit, we're not going to drive each other out of business. What we're going to do is we're all going to agree to charge the same price and stick to our territories and gouge the public as much as we can. Well, that's a conspiracy. Why? Because it's two or more people operating in secret in order to achieve a common end, which is to enhance their bottom line by cooperating, essentially by forming a conspiracy against the public as opposed to each other. But it can be, I don't know, put yourself in this kind of position. Let's say you and a group of friends decide you want to go somewhere. And then someone says, well, are we going to bring Bob? Because, Bob is a friend of yours, but Bob can be, maybe Bob doesn't hold his liquor very well. Bob gets scared. Bob's problematic. And then you all decide that, no, let's not tell him. Let's just not inform him that we're going. Well, you've just conspired against Bob. You have worked together in secret to do something and leave him out of this whole situation, and he doesn't know about it, but you deliberately did this to achieve a common end, to exclude Bob from the party because Bob could be a problem. So once you begin to get the definition, you tend to realize that conspiracy, two or more people working together in secret to attain a common end, is pretty much how the world operates. I mean, that's the fundamental before the real deal is signed, before the contracts are drawn up by the lawyers, there's a basic agreement which has already been reached among the people who are there. And it's just the way. And the thing about it, why do you try to do things in secret? Because here's another thing that I'm sure virtually everyone has noticed. If you haven't, you should have. Is that the more people you involve in any kind of decision making process, the less efficient it becomes. I mean, it's just, you have to accommodate. So the simplest thing to do is to keep the decision down to the smallest group of people that you can. That facility, and that again is essentially one of the ways in which the world works. You tend to leave a lot of people out. I mean, maybe we'll have this huge committee, but the fact is the three of us have met together and we'll already figure out how things are going to do. So what you see in public generally is simply the ritualistic rubber stamping of a decision that was already made secretly by a smaller group of people in a smoke-filled room. I don't think that really surprises anyone, but there's conspiracy for you. And the thing about something like a Masonic lodge is that it's not inherently conspiratorial. Although the idea that you're starting out by picking people by a kind of secret criterion and then swearing them to secrecy, what you created there is the perfect petri dish for conspiracy. I mean, now you've got a group of like-minded people meeting together without, outside the public eye, and doing pretty much whatever you want to. And which is not, one of the questions often is, well, what's Freemasonry about? What's going on there? You get a lot of gobbledygook answers, frankly. And and let me add as a disclaimer, I am not now, nor have I ever been a Freemason. And I don't want to be. I mean, I'm kind of interested in more I like studying it. I don't necessarily want to be a part of it. Uh, I've known many people who are. There was one side of I was as a kid, I was kind of exposed to it because I had a grandfather and other people, uncles that were all part of this organization, and I mean that was kind of interesting because I never thought they were doing anything weird, but and I still don't think they were, but they could have been. I mean, who knows? Maybe I just wasn't noticing. But the most common answer you'll get is that, well, it's a fraternal association that's about turning good men into better men. It's a process of self improvement that you go through rituals and initiations. You act out these pantomimes that in and of themselves have a kind of symbolic value. It's all about symbols and the importance of those symbols. Uh, there's If you go into the higher levels, you begin to get a dose of mysticism that begins to come in. But often it's the idea is that, well, it's just about fellowship. It's about fellowship and self improvement. Although I think the definition that I find the most interesting, which is the more formal definition, is that Freemasonry is a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols.
Hmm.
Okay, that seems clear enough. Now I ask you, what the hell does that mean? What did that just explain? Well, nothing. Okay, because it's a system of morality. I don't know what morality. Veiled in allegory, hidden in allegory. So never saying anything directly. Allegories that you would have to interpret the meaning of. What allegories? I don't know. and veiled in symbols. Well, you can see Masonic symbols, the Masonic regalia and the rest, but what exactly did it mean to the outside? You don't know. So on the one hand, you can just explain what it is, system of morality, veiled in allegory, illustrated by symbols, which seemingly explains everything while actually explaining nothing. There, there's the essence of. That's the whole esoteric for you right there. Seem to explain everything and it explains nothing. So within that kind of framework, it really depends upon how you want to define morality, what allegories you would want to choose to illustrate that, and what symbols would mean. All of that is in some way up to a matter of interpretation. So it's another way I'd say that in some level, Freemasonry is about everything and about nothing. It's in many ways what you want it to become. And that's why there's no way that you can say that it's exactly this thing in every case, because it never was.
Hmm.
Okay, from the beginning, back in 1400, all those weird little lodges of people pretending to be Masons who weren't were doing their own thing in some way, and they probably had a wide variety of practice. So it's not a brand name. Nobody owned the rights to it. They never have. If you and I wanted to get some people and call ourselves a Masonic lodge, we could do that and no one could stop us and sue us for violation of copyright. All they could do is go, you're not our kind of Freemasons, therefore we won't recognize you. So you've got all of this. There are all sorts of lodges that go back and forth that don't recognize each other. But they're still there and they still use that term.
Hmm.
It's whatever you want to make it.
The word conspiracy has been weaponized in a way that if you even bring it up, people try to use it to discredit you immediately and not have to engage the conversation about any topic whatsoever. And then I start to think of the oversimplification of these secret societies that you always hear if you watch any documentary that's based on secret societies. It seems like the oversimplification, and I'm sure you have a really nice way of packaging this, hopefully, is like what are the biggest overgeneralizations about the nature of secret societies and social engineering and where we are today versus like going back to the royal family, and you hear people talk about the Illuminati and how, it's the Bilderbergs and the Rothschilds. You always hear these names thrown around, and
Mm.
it's just like throwing paint at the wall. And I've always heard it myself, and I'm sure everyone has. If you watch a general YouTube video, it's the Rothschilds, it's the Bilderbergs, it's the Rockefellers, and it goes back, it's the Illuminati. And it's like, okay, I keep hearing this, but let's hear
Well,
about how and why it works the way that it is and how oversimplified that narrative sure sounds.
this is what Freemasonry and most secret societies get accused of, basically, is that they're up to something. Okay? The whole reason why they hide behind allegory and secrecy and oaths is that they're clearly trying to disguise something which, if known to the general public, would raise alarm and concern. So they're up to something. Okay, this is the reason why they hide this way. And that they are, it's one of the things that Freemasons were and still are often accused of is using favoritism. The This was something that came up, uh, probably the most Masonic country in the early 20th century was Great Britain. So Freemasonry was even more than the U.S. pervaded British society all the way up to the royals. And it's kind of interesting because British Freemasonry sort of escaped the anti-monarchical part of it. It became on the continent in France and elsewhere in Europe. Freemasonry became associated with revolution. It became, in many ways, associated with radical, anti-clericalism, anti-monarchy. But in Britain, the monarchy co-opted it.
Hmm.
I think basically from the 18th century on, every British monarch, with the interesting exception of George III, what went wrong for him, has been a member of the order. They were often the heads of the Grand Lodge of England. So the monarchy and Freemasonry became united in a way which elsewhere it didn't. And one of the things that was noted was that in Britain, certainly in the early part of the 20th century, there was a high preponderance of Masonic membership in two groups, the police and the judiciary. And therefore, the claim was sometimes made is that this made it impossible for someone who wasn't a Mason to really get justice out of the justice system. Because if you went into court, let's say you were suing someone, and let's say that you're not a Mason and the person you're suing happens to be, and then later you find out that the judge and that the Queen's Counsel and your own lawyer and the police involved in this are all members of the order, might you, and you lose your case, which you thought was good, could you possibly come to the idea that you had been screwed over by the fact that all of these lodge brothers, as they were sworn to do, backed each other up to your disadvantage? And so that comes down to this idea that society members, Freemasons or not, working together because of their special relationship to each other, they will, in everything they do, show favoritism to their kind over others, and thus the whole thing becomes a conspiracy against the rest of us.
Hmm.
These are people who are trying to cheat us and then pretend that they're not doing it. And yeah, that probably, the reason you lost your case more than likely was because you just had a bad case to begin with. But if I found out that everyone else involved in it was a member and I wasn't, that's a suspicion that you'd have to entertain. You would be a fool not to, even though you can't prove it. So the idea is that members of secret societies are just trying to put something over on the rest of us. The other thing that was common, a couple of people you mentioned there were the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds. What do they have in common? They're rich. So there's something else. Who else is constantly conspiring against us? The rich. Why? Why are they rich? Well, because in some way they found a way to rob the general public. Now, that's not often directly said, but that's what many people believe at one point or another. The reason that I am poor is because that person is rich. Now, that can become an excuse for a lot of things. Maybe the reason you're poor has to do with a number of things, has nothing to do with it, with the Rockefellers. But the point is, there are, and I mean, look around us today. Look at the Zuckerbergs. Look at Elon Musk. Why is this man so wealthy? Is it just because he's more intelligent or he's luckier or he's really just that inventive? Did all of his wealth just come to him freely and fairly? Was it a gift of the universe bestowed upon him because of his sterling character? Or is it because in some way he was involved with others in what was basically a conspiracy against the public to work a relationships in order to enrich himself at the expense of others?
But there is a component of having wealth. It's not to say they're conspiring to steal the money or to have that wealth, but it's more about centralization of power. And when you have, say, the royal family, or you have these Rockefellers or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, for instance, or you look at Klaus Schwab, you look at these people in modern day, it's like, it's not that you have to think about it as like the evil man. It's almost just natural to think that you'd want more and more money, which Elon doesn't seem to care as much about money as he does the power to have an effect on the environment, to engineer the environment the way that he wants it. And if you think about like when you want power, which is the wealth component, I always think like,
Mhm.
why money? It's not that money's bad. It's that the use of money, it's the idea of amplification of your consciousness is more available when you have more money. And I'm just curious, like what you think about the WEF and the WHO, like during COVID per se. And there was an orchestrated effort. You don't have to get all freaky. You don't have to be freakishly and look at it as conspiratory in a bad way. But obviously, there's conspiracy involved to get everybody on board to do exactly what they've done over the last 5 years. And it is a centralized power thing. So I'm just curious what you think about in that way.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's not about the money, because money, I mean, think of it. If you've got $600 billion, money actually becomes less meaningful to you than it, the people who money means a lot to are the people who have to try to scramble to pay their rent every night. If you're working two jobs at minimum wage and you can barely pay your rent and are one step away from living in your car, then money becomes very, very important, because that means, you know, getting food and shelter. On the other hand, when you're a billionaire, you no longer have to worry about it. You can afford anything you want to buy, anything. You never have to worry about any of these things. So the money part of it just becomes insignificant. You could pass your time just piling up money and burning it, because there's just more of it in that way. So that's one of the differences, I think, is that, the poor or common people who are kind of struggling to survive, money becomes an obsession to them, and they see these people with all of this money, and that becomes their focus. When the money is simply a means to an end. So now you've got billions of dollars, especially when, you weren't born with billions of dollars. Some people are, but, let's say you didn't have much of anything. I don't know. Bill Gates might be an example. He didn't come from wealth, but now he's got a huge amount of money. And I think, as one person put it, who had a lot of money, is that one of the things that hits you at some point is that, why me? I mean, if you look around you for that, you realize that very few of your peers and most people that you meet, and all those little ants out there in the street that you're looking down on from your office, they don't have any money. So why you? Why are you one of the rare individuals on the entire planet in all of history who has acquired this vast amount of wealth? Well, a couple of reasons. One is you're tremendously talented, but you probably know that's not entirely true. See, the thing is that even you can't explain it. I mean, maybe that the whole idea you made this money off of was really somebody else who isn't rich, but you were able to market that idea in some way. And the reason is that you were just lucky. Things just sort of broke for you in a way. But then that gets into this whole question: is what's luck? I mean, is this just kind of blind happenstance, or is it divine providence? Have I been chosen in some way? So the idea, I would think, that begins to percolate into the minds of people who attain great wealth is that they have in some way been chosen by providence to do something with that wealth. Now, you felt a need to sort of prove why you have it. And then one of the things you can find is that every idea that's ever passed through your head, you now have the money to actualize in some way. And so you become very, you form a foundation, and then you find things that you like and you begin throwing money at it. Or you find things that you don't like and you begin throwing money at it to oppose it. And you also can hire people and you can get them to do things. Money, for all those people who are worrying about paying their bills, giving them money is a way of controlling them. So money becomes a way to influence and control and to project your will into the world. And then you end up, I think, with people like, Schwab, who essentially talks, it seems, he probably doesn't think so, maybe he does, who condescendingly advises all of the little people how they should live. Because he and his ilk, in some way, by being chosen by providence to have wealth, have been given a kind of mandate to rule. And that they know what's best for you. Which some people would accept, which most wouldn't. But that idea begins to percolate into it. It's where did the divine right of kings come from? I mean, all monarchies, if you trace it back far enough, start with a murderer and a horse thief. All right, that's where they were. Nobody was. Nobility is not a currency in nature. It doesn't exist. It's a thing that people invent. So you end up with somebody who kills someone to seize the crown, and then they eventually cover themselves in a whole variety of ritual and legend and panoply and the rest. But that's their whole basis. And then you have some sort of pesky guy like Voltaire who comes along and says that that's all BS. Let's cut his head off. And then you find out you can kill them with impunity. But I think it's almost a natural progression in the human ego that if you have a lot of money, it doesn't seem to fill people often, and there are exceptions, with humility. It tends to make them think even more of themselves than they did before because they've been chosen by providence to have this wealth. And now their ideas, because they can project them, become very important. Maybe their ideas are good. Maybe they're terrible. The point is, they're no judge of it. They just got the money.
Yeah, and it seems like, especially in the new like transhumanist, if you want to call it, movement, it's a religion of its own. And when you get a lot of money and influence and power, and you want to organize and create maybe and drive the future the way that you want, because you do have that capacity to, like you said, delegate and orchestrate and manifest things in that manner, the way Elon can create so much so quickly without even knowing what's going on with half of the things that he's probably creating while he's tweeting 6,000 times a week. I don't know how he does it all, but I'm just thinking that I have a deep fascination with, and I'd love to hear your perspective on the development after World War II of Operation Paperclip and the CIA, and how we sort of took all of the psychological understanding and the engineering of what they learned during the nasty experiments that they did. And I interviewed Tom O'Neill, and I've sort of went down this rabbit hole just enough to get some scaffolding. And I loved his book Chaos. I know you read it because you
Yeah.
said that you really appreciated it. And I think I heard you on Lex Friedman talking a little bit about it, but I'm like, this has to be, to me, the most fascinating part of our American history is what we learned from the Nazis from World War II, the development of the Operation Paperclip, the hiring of hundreds, if not thousands, of Nazis, the best scientists and engineers and whatnot, creating our CIA, and then manufacturing without consent social experiments on our own citizens, which is what MKUltra develops into, and it becomes this a compartmentalized whole bunch of other sub programs. And it turns into eventually things like the psychedelic renaissance, which is now today being somewhat deployed. And it's like, what have we learned from that, and how did it develop? And can you go into a little bit about this Operation Paperclip and the MK Ultra story? And it gets into Manson, and it's an incredible piece of history.
Well, let me begin though with something else that you brought up, and then I'll
Okay.
try to weave
Yeah.
these two things together. You were talking about people like Musk and others, the people with great wealth that can manifest that. So they can buy anything except one thing. So if you have all the money in the world,
Immortality.
immortality, you can't buy more life. And if you really develop a bloated enough ego that you think that you're one of the most important people, that's got to be, you're going to build all of this stuff and then you're going to die. So it becomes a fixation. And if you look at something like, you look at this kind of singularity concept, the whole idea, well, let's get it simple. The concept that in some way or another you can digitize yourself. You can take your consciousness and, to simplify it, put it into a computer.
Yeah. Ray
And there are
Kurzweil's
people who are
thing.
working on that. I mean, that frankly is what I think is the actual thing which is driving AI. One is to create digital slaves, but we'll do anything you want. But to create this whole concept that you can become to achieve digital immortality, the one thing that money in itself otherwise cannot buy you. And that's a very, very old concept. And I'll just throw in here that that's the key work of alchemy. So I would, I'll say it right here that I think that one of the things which is percolating beneath the surface in a lot of the tech development is simply modern digital alchemy. Because the great work of the alchemist was to transform themselves into a higher state of being. It was to become God. It was to be immortal. It's not about turning lead into gold. That's a parlor trick. It's about turning oneself into a higher elevated state of being. And if you look at the goal of sort of digital immortality, it's exactly the same thing. It is simply alchemy being pursued under different means. And I'm not even necessarily sure that the people who do this are aware of it, but that's what's going on. So part of it, I think that the basic thing that comes down to it is trying to figure out what the reality actually is. Because it's not apparently quite what we think it is. Now you can get into the whole sort of realm of quantum physics, and I'm not a physicist, so I have a layman's understanding of this, but I think I can catch the gist of it, which is that if you sort of add up all the little data points in quantum physics, it implies that reality as we know it doesn't actually exist. You can just you can reduce things down to a level where there's nothing there. So here is our first great mystery. Our reality is the creation of something from nothing. So what is it exactly? So I think, again, paraphrasing a bit, Einstein, who gets credited for saying all kinds of brilliant things, it was that, reality is a hallucination, basically, but a very, very persistent one. One which somehow we can't, other people would argue that it's a matrix, which we can't really invent. Now, I don't know. I admit that I have some, I can set, outside in the yard in a nice day and the hummingbirds are going on. And I'm looking at this, like, is this just all some sort of like digital, is this some sort of holographic projection? Or is that just total BS? I mean, is this just the physical world and that's what it is? And, or is it not really there? Well, you don't want to do that too long or they'll go nuts. But some people probably have. But that's one of the basic things we have is that, you know, and if you think about it in a certain way, that we're living in what appears to be this very solid, deterministic world, which isn't real. So is it some sort of manifest? Are we all collectively hallucinating this, or what's going on? Your head will spin after a while. But there's a very basic thing: reality itself is of unknown origin and has a kind of unknown quantity to it. Then the other question becomes, is it malleable? To what extent can we alter that reality? So, and that, by the way, is one of the chief goals. Aleister Crowley, I think, there we go. I knew he would have to come up.
Hmm.
Defined magic, which is the kind of operative mechanism in occultism, as the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So if you ever hear anybody today talking about manifesting success, let's manifest these things, that's just magic that they're talking about. They're not using that term because manifest is the idea that if you sort of imagine what you want and you think about it as having already been accomplished, if you just take the right mental attitude, if you alter your consciousness, you can, through that, alter reality itself. Now, that's either a great illumination or it's just completely nuts, but nevertheless, it's an idea that certainly people have always been pursuing. And that again is that's what everything within occultism is trying to do. That's what rituals are about. Rituals are trying to mimic the result that you want. That's what you're trying to do. Um, I give you an everyday example of that people wouldn't think was a ritual, and I think it's something that's pretty general experience, at least in America. High school pep rally. Ever attend a high school pep rally? College pep rally. That's a ritual to ensure victory over the other team. And look, you get people together, you get them worked up with music, you raise a sort of emotional level. You've got people dressed in animal costumes prancing around. You've got dancing virgins or, some sort of, theoretically. Okay. Yes. You got all of these things that are meant to arouse some sort of response, but which every ritual does. It's a series of actions performed in a way, in a precise order and in a precise manner to evoke a response in the audience. And the whole goal of this, and what are you chanting at a pep rally? Well, you're chanting that, death to the enemy, victory to us. Of course, your opponents are having their own rival ritual at the same time, possibly canceling each other out. But who was ever strongest? And you'll notice that the thing that you could be criticized at for doing this is not showing proper enthusiasm. Because every Debbie Downer that comes into the pep rally that doesn't get worked up and doesn't get enthused and doesn't wish the death of the opposing team and victory for ours is undermining our effort. That is a magic ritual. You are trying to envision the victorious success of your team and to assure it by getting everybody into the same sort of mental state to manifest that reality. So we seem to have this idea intuitively that we can, through the application of individual or mass will, alter the course of events. So what if you actually got people who took that seriously and tried to figure out how it works? Because apparently it's all in our heads. Well, it is. And here's an interesting way of thinking about it. This was something somebody mentioned to me years back. I don't even remember who, but it kind of freaked me out at the time, but it still does. And their whole idea is they go, look, what reality is, everything that you see and experience is just a movie projected inside your head. That's where all of this is going on. Because your eyes and ears, you're just getting the sensory perceptions that are coming in. Your brain is interpreting it and organizing it, sometimes in ways that aren't real, perhaps. I mean, you don't know what the source material was. We're getting something that's been arranged for us because our whole brain is designed to take all of this data and arrange it into recognizable shapes. And yeah, it's not too difficult to figure out how it can be fooled into doing things. Everything your brain tells you is not true. So your own mind is an unreliable narrator. It will create things for you that aren't necessarily real, which then creates the whole problem of what's real to begin with, and it all becomes this horrible circle. But the idea that reality is a movie projected inside our heads. It's our brain's interpretation of this. Well, what's outside your head? Everything else. There's a whole different now that inside our heads we create this world for ourselves, but outside of it is this whole world that much of it we can't even see or sense. And that's where the angels and the demons and the monsters and the dragons and everything else that percolates is from, and we have no idea what that is. And to me, that was a kind of scary concept, that reality is just this movie projected inside our heads. So we have to keep everybody watching the same movie. Okay, that becomes the kind of matrix. So it then becomes a key to figuring out how the human mind works. And that's where you get into things like MKUltra, because that's one way it was described to me is that the whole purpose of these programs that began in the 1950s, really in the late 1940s, was to understand the architecture of the human mind. How does it work? And then once figuring out how it works, how you can change it. So we usually trace a lot of this, I think, as you mentioned, back to the Nazis. So let's go back to Nazi Germany, lasted 12 years. That's how long the regime existed. An incredibly short period of time in history, but a huge amount of stuff which was packed into that. And the regime placed a high importance upon technical innovation, partly because they got themselves involved in a war in which technology was the only way to get out of it, and that failed. They were defeated. None of the wonder weapons saved them. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the Nazis as a political organization were extremely bad at managing things. Okay, they were not geniuses. Hitler, Himmler, and the rest of them, Himmler could organize the S, but they really messed things up. What? They only managed to stay in power for 12 years. They managed to get themselves involved in a war against everybody that they couldn't win and were catastrophically defeated. But in the process of this, even within that brief period of 12 years, they created this kind of military industrial complex. I mean, Germany was a technologically sophisticated country that the Nazis just took over. They didn't really come up with any of this. They took it over. Germany had, from the early 20th century, been in the cutting edge of development in a whole variety of technological spheres. And the Nazis, as a regime, frankly, just squandered that. So they threw a certain amount of money at rocketry, and they put Werner von Braun in control, but they never really developed anything significantly. They played around with stuff, but other people could pick up the pieces of it. So they were doing all kinds of things, and then of course once the Nazi demon was defeated, there was another one which appeared from a Western standpoint. Your erstwhile allies, the ones that actually did most of the work in defeating the Nazi demon, the Soviets. And now your former enemies, the Nazis have been defanged at this point. The regime no longer exists, but all of those technocrats and scientists and engineers they had working for them, well, they exist. And they can do things like build rockets. So there was this immediate rush, even before the war is over, by both the West, which was principally the Americans, with the Brits in tow, and the Soviets, trying to grab up every German engineer and scientist they could, because these people had technical knowledge that we could use. So the Soviets grabbed a bunch of them. That was instrumental in their rocket and space program. And then we grabbed a bunch of them, von Braun being the best example. And those guys, essentially, that's where the space program came from. You wouldn't have had that without them. There simply wasn't, at that time, in the US, a cadre of people with experience in things like rocketry and aerodynamics that the German engineers possessed to do it. And they were instrumental they were critical to the eventual space program that emerged. Now, lots of times people say, well, these were all Nazi scientists. Well, some of them were members of the Nazi party. Von Braun was. I think he actually held a rank in the SS. It doesn't mean that he was necessarily ideologically committed to that. So you didn't really get necessarily, I think, for most of these scientists, they're not Nazi ideologues. That is, they're not sort of steeped in National Socialist ideology. It may have had some influence on them. No, there's something else. They are professional technocrats. You're an engineer. You're an engineer who builds rockets. And I think von Braun is a good example of this, and it's nothing against him. He built rockets for Hitler because Hitler was the guy who ran the place that he worked for. And then when the Americans brought him over, he built rockets for the Americans because they were the ones who were paying him and enabling him to work his craft. Engineers are craftsmen. They're people with particular skills. And that's what they're interested in. Who's paying them? The ideological interest of who's paying them is relatively insignificant in most places. I mean, you'll always sing the praise of who it is you're working for. So, oh yes, I'm so glad to be working for him. Well, that's the choice you had. You could either be working here, you could be working in Moscow, or you could be unemployed in post-war Germany. That's the practical aspect of it. So I don't think in most cases there's no ideologically driven. It's just technocrats, technically trained, proficient people exercising their skills. Another way to put it, they're mercenaries. They work for money and the privileges that position gives them. There's no fundamental loyalty to anything. It's not necessary for that to do it. So you got people who knew how to build rockets. You also had people who had, the Nazis are often assumed to have had a kind of superlative intelligence situation, which they really didn't. And Nazi German intelligence apparatus wasn't, on the whole, I don't think that good. And partly because it was never centralized, but you had work which had been going on for a long time prior to that in terms of trying to figure out how the mind worked. And I think it's incorrect to assume that it's the Nazis who were doing that, because there are all kinds of people working on this. So, for instance, in Soviet Russia in the 1920s, there was a guy I've written about a bit by the name of Alexander Barchenko. Alexander Barchenko was a kind of self-trained. He was interested in anything sort of woo-woo. There you go. He started out as a kind of a science fiction writer, don't they all? And then he thought and so he was interested in everything from unidentified flying objects to lost civilizations to psi powers, and he eventually became sort of enlisted by Soviet intelligence, by another fellow in particular by the name of Gleb Boki, who also shared his interest, who was a Freemason, esoteric Freemason, Rosicrucian guy who liked to have, occult orgies on his estate. But so one of the things that Barchenko was doing for the Soviet secret police was coming up with ideas. One of the things he developed was, it was sort of an early version of the God helmet, of this thing that you would put on your head, and it was supposedly enhance psychic abilities so that you could read minds and project thoughts. And Barchenko was an early proponent of the idea that the brain was both like a receiver and a transmitter, and therefore it should be possible for one mind to project thoughts to another and to receive thoughts from other minds. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Barchenko's talking about doing this in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Doesn't necessarily get very far with it, but that was the idea that he was pursuing, and which the Soviet secret police, what would become the KGB, were employing him to do. Why? Well, imagine the applications to espionage. The whole thing in espionage is trying to hide information and acquire it. Well, if we could find a way to project our minds into the enemy camp and just read their secrets inside the vault, or if we could implant thoughts in people's minds in some way to mislead them, well, that would be we would have a vast advantage over everyone else in the field of espionage. So, and notice that's exactly the same things like the Stargate, okay, all of this remote viewing business. It's just continuing the work that Barchenko was doing in Russia in the 20s. I don't think people are copying that, but they're after the same sort of thing. And notice the way in which intelligence agencies, from military agencies, the CIA in particular, doggedly pursues this, always while outwardly saying that, we tried this stuff and it didn't work. We kept at it for 18 years, but it took us that long to figure out it didn't work. Well, if it didn't work, they're not going to tell you. Because if they told you, they would be telling their opponents that it worked. And the last thing you want your enemy to figure out is that what you were working on worked. So you don't want them to think it does. Maybe it didn't. But the denial that it worked also is absolutely necessary if it did. So you have to figure out what's true or false there. So this stuff has been going on. It wasn't the Nazis. And in fact, I'd even bring Aleister Crowley into this. Why? Well, because he's Aleister Crowley. But Crowley, not to go too deep into his rabbit hole, but during World War I, he's in the United States, and he's doing a variety of things. And some of the stuff that he's doing, quite clearly, is at the behest of British intelligence. They sent him to America on a secret mission. What that mission consists of is a whole vast story in itself, and a lot of speculation there. But he was working for it. They admitted it. Okay. In 1918, they admit this. And so one of the things that Crowley did is that he was a great connoisseur of what we would call recreational drugs. His favorite was ether, which is one step above huffing gas as far as I can tell. But, personally, that's what he liked to do, is go on an ether jag. But he also enjoyed psychedelics, peyote, mescaline. And it was when he was in the U.S. and during the First World War, around 1916, that Parke Davis Pharmaceuticals in Detroit was the first firm to synthesize the psychoactive element in peyote, mescaline, and they came up with it. And he went there and he bought like a pound of it in a paper bag. So so he's carrying around with him this whole paper bag full of a pound of mescaline, and he goes through it. But one of the things that he would do is that he would invite a group of people over for a dinner. And these people would be of different ages, men, women, old, young, fat, thin, different types. And then he would fix them some sort of meal, often a savory curry, because that can disguise so many different tastes. And then he would add a certain, proportion of mescaline to the meal. And then he would basically seemingly avoid eating that himself, and he would record the results. He would keep notes as to how the different guests responded. So a particular dose of mescaline delivered to these different people on different occasions, how do they respond to that? Now here's a question. Why was he doing that? Did that have some sort of occult application? What? How exactly would that further his magical pursuits? No, he was keeping notes like a research scientist, which he wasn't really, but that's what he was doing because he was curious about the actual physical and psychological effects that this drug had. Now, the other interesting thing is that he recorded his observations about this, supposedly in one of the volumes of his writings, which was dubbed The Cactus. One might suspect that has some connection to peyote. But that's one of the volumes of his work, one of his libers, which has since 1919 never been seen again.
Hmm.
It existed. I mean, he mentions its existence, but it's in no, as far as we know, it's in no known collection. Jimmy Page doesn't have it. Other collectors don't have it. The OTO doesn't appear. I mean, maybe somebody does and they're keeping quiet about it, but it just sort of vanished off the face of the earth. So that's kind of intriguing. So Crowley, apparently on his own initiative, although while employed by British intelligence, is keeping detailed notes about the effects of psychedelic compounds on human beings. Those notes later go missing. Or did he just turn them over to whoever it was who commissioned him to do that work? So I guess my point in all this, if I have one, is that it wasn't just the Nazis who did it, and they didn't start it. This was going on. Data on this type of thing was being collected at the time of the First World War. Data on this type of thing was being collected in Soviet Russia in the 1920s. So when the US military and the newly minted CIA begin in the late 1940s to develop programs like Mockingbird and Artichoke, which then eventually transform in 1953 into MKUltra, which then will transform into MK Search, and then will supposedly go all the way to 1973 when it's stopped, which it isn't. It just gets another name. That this is something that's much older. There's been sort of research going on in this for some time from different angles.
Mm-hmm.
But what you had, let's say, in the context of the US, in the hands of something like the CIA in the early 1950s, is remember, they've got threads to all of this. They've got volunteer German engineers and scientists. They've got their allies, the British, with whatever information they might have picked up. They're also constantly collecting information from their opponents, the Soviets. They've got their fingers in all of this. And therefore, what's sort of going on with MK Ultra is an effort to probably take all of these earlier threads and components and continue work in the same direction. So, how does the human mind work? What are its component parts? How can those comparts be altered in some way? How can you get people to do what you want without them knowing that you're doing this? That becomes the kind of key component. So if you look at what it is, I mean, we've only got this tiny little, like residue of what it was that was going on in all of these programs. There was something like 150 programs and sub-programs, and they were looking into all kinds of stuff, including things that were, quite frankly, occult. The application of come back to this idea: can you alter reality by the application of will? Well, I don't know. Let's find out. Let's throw a bunch of money at it and see what happens. But what we do know with some confidence is that they were very interested in things like the application of drugs, the chemical alteration of consciousness, but then also with hypnosis. And that, I think, is kind of because hypnosis is one of those things that I don't think we really understand what's going on, do we? I don't know. Nobody's ever been able to explain to me exactly what hypnosis is and how it works. I've actually had people argue that there's no such thing as hypnosis. I think because they can't conceive that it would exist. Yet it doesn't work on everybody. Some people are highly susceptible, most people a little bit susceptible, others I mean, I've for whatever it's worth, there were a couple of occasions where people have, I volunteered to be hypnotized and nothing happened. It was just like taking acid and it was no good. Okay. Nothing happened. Okay. So, but that doesn't, I saw its effects on other people, so I know that something was going on, but I just can't say from my own personal experience what that was. It doesn't mean anything to me, but it did have an application somewhere else. And I actually ran across, there's a declassified document that it's an FBI report, and it's from 1949. So keep in mind, MKUltra doesn't really get started until 53. There are precedent, there were earlier formations, 51, 50, but this is 1949. This is very early. And it's the FBI's report about a meeting that took place at a private home in New York City, at the home of a kind of inventor and investor by the name of Alfred Loomis, who ran his own sort of private labs, but which did contractor. He was the kind of person that the CIA would contract to do work for them on the side because it wasn't official. So it's a meeting that's being held in a private home. And the FBI is not there, but they're getting a report on this because J. Edgar Hoover wasn't a big fan of the CIA. He thought they had no reason to exist. They were, treading on his territory. But that meant he was also very interested in what they were up to. So there were a group of individuals there, and the two key presenters at this meeting were both CIA officers. One of them was by the name of Cleve Baxter. And for people who tend to look into this kind of realm, Cleve Baxter is an interesting name because this is Mr. Lie Detector. Cleve Baxter sort of invented modern lie detector. He wrote the book on this, literally, which is a very interpretive thing. The whole thing, he would argue, is that it's not the machine, it's the operator of the machine. The machine just gives indication. The operator interprets. Whether the person is telling the truth or lying is really rests upon not the machine, but the interpretation of the operator. Now, the other thing Cleve Baxter was later noted for is that he's the guy who also decided through his experiments that plants could think and feel. That's Cleve Baxter. So Baxter is there along with the other guy, and they're giving a presentation to the people there. And there's a lot of redaction. Keep in mind, this is an FBI report. So the whole thing that kind of directly says what they're doing is redacted, but it doesn't take much imagination to figure out what they're talking about because they'll then describe what they're doing. And their whole presentation is on hypnotic suggestion and its use in influencing minds. And they raise, in one unredacted part, the most important part of this thing to me is they go, well, this has certain applications. And they go, one of the things we're looking for is that what application does hypnotic suggestion have in the ability to implant false memories in someone's mind, and at the same time to eliminate memories from their minds. And it may not be that important to sound, but this sort of caught my attention, because what they're talking about in 1949 is the use of techniques that would create false memories and to eliminate memories, all without the knowledge of the person that this had taken place. And what intrigued me about this is that it echoed what it was. There's a very odd character that I've taken an interest in because I just like these guys, by the name of James Shelby Downard. He sort of figures in the further weird fringes of American conspiracy theory. And Downard is a guy who, let me put it this way, claimed that's what his whole problem was. Now, on the one hand, you can say that Downard is just a complete paranoid. Okay, he has these weird visions of things, and he has this whole completely improbable vision of it. But Downard claimed in the late 1940s and the 50s that that's what happened to him, that his real memories were erased and false memories were implanted, and his whole then current psychosis was his effort to try to recover his real memories. So there's all kinds of very good reasons to believe that James Shelby Downard was just that. He was a paranoid schizophrenic, and you should therefore pay no attention to him. But as someone else once told me, just because he's crazy doesn't mean he's wrong. Who's to say they couldn't be right about that? And I just thought that was odd, that at the same time that Downard seems to be claiming that this was what was being done to him, you now have these CIA guys in this secret meeting in New York saying, this is what we think we could do. So someone was actually contemplating doing exactly what this crazy person then later says, ostensible crazy person, said was done to them. Now, that's just kind of a weird coincidence. Or, as in the case of most coincidences, it's no coincidence at all. So that's what they were trying to do. And the question then becomes, because we have so little information as to how successful they were in doing it, a lot of attention is turned towards things like creating mind-controlled assassins. And among the few documents that survive, they were demonstrably able to do that. They describe this. They particularly women, and they hypnotize her and tell her to go over and pretend to shoot her friend, and she does it, and then later has no memory of it. I don't know. Maybe they were making that up, but if they're not making it up, that's exactly so. I don't know how you can then claim that you never were able to succeed in creating a mind control assassin when you've just got a report that you just apparently created a mind controlled assassin. So the whole Manchurian candidate thing is just one little tiny step from reality, which is a strange book. And what I'm thinking of here is the Frank Sinatra Manchurian Candidate, the first one that was done, I think it's 61 or 62. And that's a very interesting film. And I'd suggest that anybody who's, maybe I'm just telling you something you've already noticed, but the whole thing is about, the Lawrence Harvey character who's captured by the insidious Soviets and Chinese and brainwashed, and his mother's involved. I mean, that's generally what you're looking at. That's where all the attention is. And the way in which he is controlled through hypnotic programming. But someone pointed out to me is that if you actually watch the film, and I'm not sure how this corresponds so much with what's in the book, the film, but in the film itself, you've got the Frank Sinatra character, who's kind of the hero who uncovers this whole thing, and who's been through this kind of mind control thing himself. The same thing that was done to Harvey was done to him. Sinatra's memories of what happened were erased. But in the process of his discovery of what's going on, He encounters a female character on a train played by Janet Leigh. And one of the things I suggest that if you rewatch the film to watch very carefully is when the Sinatra character meets the Janet Leigh character on the train, because they just sort of meet and they start flirting. And then at one point, she begins giving him, he asks her for an address or a phone number, and she begins looking him in the eye, and she's reciting numbers to him. And as the person looked, they said, look, what that is that the Sinatra character is also being hypnotically controlled in this film, and Janet Leigh is his controller. So who is she? They said she's just she's not just a love interest in the film. She's just this character who emerges, meets him on a train, and then takes hypnotic control of him, then leading him ultimately to the revelation of this. So that there are actually two sort of systems of control that are going on.
Hmm.
And I don't think I'm imagining things, but after being told that, I rewatched it and I go, yeah, this is this whole scene that you think is that these people flirting, but it's actually her taking control of him. So you can try to see if you see that in the next thing you have in the film. So there's no question that these experiments were done, and most of them we don't know about. The only question is to what degree success was attained. And if success was attained, it could never be admitted. You can't do that. So the veil was kind of lifted on this when in the mid 70s, partly because of the assassinations that had taken place, Congress got involved and Frank Church got involved and the Senate and the rest of it, and there were all these hearings. And that's why the MK Ultra records and the rest of it were mostly destroyed on Richard Helms' orders in '73. And they were destroying this because, yes, they had committed a lot of crimes. They had been carrying out medical experiments on American citizens without their permission. This is verboten. You're not supposed to do that. But they did it anyway. And now they were going to cover it up. And ostensibly, it meant that they were going to stop. We're not going to do any naughty things like this anymore. This was wrong. We're not going to do it. Well, what you're not going to do is you're not really going to do it through the agency anymore. You're not going to have the technical services division doing this. Because, see, what that does is that it generates official government documents and reports that at some point some nosy person can get a hold of because of the Freedom of Information Act. So what do? You farm it out. You assign the work to ostensibly private enterprises that are not subject to any kind of disclosure. They don't have to show their records to anyone. And that is simply what happened to that research, and then to some degree or another, it continues today in the same way. Through institutes, foundations, a whole variety of private entities that might be funded by the agency or maybe not, and they carry on that work. To what end? That's something you're just supposed to know.
Right. And that's what I think all the major colleges are now tied to that same time in history. It's like you got the Johns Hopkins University, you got Stanford, and it seems to me that they are um, the institutions that are now running the experimentation, and they're tied to this stuff. And it's like now there's this sort of guinea pig testing on the masses or experimentation going on. It's very fascinating. And Tom O'Neill won't go there. He won't speculate. He likes to stay in his lane, which I appreciate. It's a deep lane for him to keep going into the Manson story and where it trickles from there. But I also interviewed Stephen Kinzer, who wrote Poisoner in Chief, it was about
Mm-hmm.
Sidney Gottlieb.
Yeah.
And he wasn't willing to go there. He kept saying, well, Sidney Gottlieb, admitted that MKUltra never did find out how to create a Manchurian candidate, or they never did. They were never successful. And it's like, well, why would he admit that they were? And that's what I asked him. But I even interviewed John Marks, who wrote the Manchurian Candidate, and he wouldn't even speak about the book in order to do the conversation. Of course, he goes, "I'm done with that chapter of my life. Let's stick to what I'm working on now." And it was almost like there's so much nefarious stuff that he exposed in that time frame of his life that then he had to be under. It's almost like he has a gun to his head, basically. It's like if you ever speak openly about this stuff any further, you're not going to have a good life. If you want to, you better keep quiet, type of thing. That's almost how it felt to me. But
Well,
it's just
it comes
interesting.
down as usual to what you want to believe. So again, you got the argument that if Gottlieb told you that he didn't find, why would you believe him? I mean,
Right.
that's the simple. Okay, I mean, why? Again, if you were successful, which isn't, I mean, maybe it was all of, maybe it was a vast experiment and it didn't turn up anything that was entirely usable. In the case of the use of psychedelics to enhance that type of thing, I tend to probably think that was the case because it's difficult to get kind of regular results. But it doesn't mean you're not going to try. But in the case of hypnosis, I don't know if the documents survive. Look like they were doing pretty well on that. But what you're developing here are techniques that if you actually discovered them, it's just like stealth technology. Okay, you're going to deny that it exists until you can actually apply it in some form. You have to do that. You have to cover it up. Um, it's like someone once noted that if you want to pay attention to what sort of areas of research are going on, especially in things like military technologies, you read the journals. Okay, all of the stuff that's coming out about we're experimenting with this, and I don't know. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, you had people out there who are talking about time travel, which okay, that's we're dealing in fantasy here, but and they're sort of doing experiments in this, and there are all these journal articles, and then you notice that all those articles just stop. Nobody's publishing on this anymore. Nobody's talking about it. There was research that was being done, and then it just stops, and there are no more papers. Well, there are one of two possibilities. One is that everybody realized that this was a dead end and a waste of time, and they couldn't get any more research money, so they turned to something else. That's entirely plausible. It's perhaps odd that this would all occur to them at the same time, or that the research was noted, it was then taken into a black projects area, and because this was something, and you're not going to talk about this anymore. So all public, it doesn't mean the research stopped. It meant that the research was no longer carried out in a public venue. And that, in fact, was a version I got from the fellow whose job, say for who, was to go through journals looking for references to particular research, and the thing that he was looking for was research threads that disappeared.
Hmm.
That was what he found significant when they stopped talking about these things that a lot of money had been put into. So I think it is at best naive to assume that you would ever get a straight answer from the people who are conducting this kind of research, because this is secret.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that kind of realm, and they will lie to you. There's no reason why they wouldn't. That doesn't prove anything. Maybe it didn't work. Um, Maybe some of it worked and others didn't, but that's not for you and I to know. It's for you and I to sit back and guess at.
Mm-hmm.
But no, you're not going to stick with something. You can determine pretty quickly whether or not somebody's working. You don't need years and years and years and years and years to keep at it. You need years and years and years to refine what you're doing, to figure out what works and what doesn't, and begin to go to hone in on what seems to be essential.
Yeah. And it seems much easier now with the technology in combination with what they've gotten from MKUltra and all the information that they accumulated and did learn. It's like you look at what happened with Jack Ruby and Oswald, which I think Tom's next book will be honing in on a little bit more. But it's like that Jolly and West character, the psychologist that was there to sort of scramble his brain or whatever. But it's so fascinating, this Manchurian candidate stuff, because it really is something that we're seeing today. Even the Trump assassination, the attempted assassination, that young kid was in a BlackRock commercial, and then all of a sudden they go to his apartment and it's completely scrubbed. And it's like he has zero social media, zero. And you're like, was he just being groomed and being manipulated into this situation? We don't know, which is the cool part. But Sure is fun to speculate and to wonder how much and how sophisticated are these newer programs that they're doing. And I think one of the things I like to look at now is this really big, you can see it's a deployment of psychedelics into the mainstream in a certain medical model. And they're using veterans and first responders and people with trauma. They're going after the same vulnerable people in society and saying it's for healing, of course, which there's potential for that. And they're using ketamine and different psychedelics, these same institutions that were tied to all of this dark stuff. And you're going to see a really weird experimentation going on, and I wonder what that's going to lead to, because one of the ideas is like Aldous Huxley's Soma. He talks a lot about in Brave New World, where it's you get everybody just numb enough and distracted enough to where it's like they're actually going to be the most suggestible, and they're almost willing to be slaves because they feel good. So dopamine, and you look at TikTok and vape pens and cannabis and microdosing. And so everybody's just basically high. So they don't have the negative emotion and the negative response that would actually drive them to look at what the problem in society is. So it's a fascinating idea to me, is this psychedelic renaissance that we're seeing.
The microdosing thing. You can, you can improve my performance by taking small amounts of. I mean, maybe you can, but it's the thing I think that always has to be done in this realm is to simply accept that there's only a limited amount that you can know. In fact, you really don't know a lot, and it's the same sort of conclusion in some way that I've come to. This is going to be a weird statement from a professional historian, which is that most history is bunk. Okay, and I think I'm actually paraphrasing um, Henry Ford, which is an odd guy to, but Ford, whatever else he might have been, was perceptive in a certain way, and I think it was Ford that said, history is bunk, and a great deal of it is because it's you heard this term historical narrative, which is always a nice way of saying story. There's a story. So the actual facts that you have, everyone is saying, oh yeah, facts. Okay, facts are kind of few and far between, and even a lot of them are kind of debatable. So I give you a simple example. We can all pretty much agree that it is a fact that the Second World War occurred. Okay, but you can get into the nuances of defining. Well, did it begin at 39 here, at 37 in Asia? Was it really one? Okay, but something we can call World War II actually happened. Okay, a lot of people got killed. There was a lot of fighting, huge explosions. Areas were devastated. That is a fact. Now, when you then get into the questions as to when precisely did it begin, why did it begin? Well, that's opinion. There are no facts when it comes to that. There are different things that you can evaluate that this appears to be important, there are that appears to be important. But the thing you can do is that you can then take that fact and you can embed it in different narratives. And all of those narratives, to one degree or another, work. So you can take the same factual points, the same sort of data points, and you can work them into a story, which will then explain how they relate together. And you can often create two stories that are completely diametrically opposed to each other. You can switch who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. But it all includes those facts. So which is the real narrative? Which is the truth? Well, none of them, totally. I mean, you can pick the one that you like, and you can go along with that. And an example of it, the U.S. has its whole sort of myth of World War II and of America's role in it and how everything turned out, the rest of it. And in that, for instance, something like the D-Day operation is absolutely key, essential. It's a critical battle, so on. Now, if you look at the Russian or the Soviet view of that, they went through the same war, but they have a completely different view. And to them, D-Day is unimportant. Okay, it's the Battle of Byelorussia that actually say so. The same sort of facts, and D-Day is a fact. Operation Bagration is a fact, but their relative significance just depends upon how you want to evaluate those things. And you can create, it's, moving into it, I was watching a YouTube video. What else? Watch way too many of those. And it was Quentin Tarantino talking about a particular scene in the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. A movie that takes an actual event and puts it in a narrative that changes the ending of it.
Good
So
film.
it's the whole Manson story, but it just doesn't. It's an alternate reality version of that. Although all the rest of it sort of leads up to that point. But he's talking about the Brad Pitt character, and there's this whole sort of thing in the movie as to whether or not the Brad Pitt character killed his wife. People accuse him of doing this, and Tarantino's talking about how, well, you can imagine this in two ways. In one is that he did kill her, and in the other is that it was just an accident that happened, but he still gets blamed for killing her. And he goes, those are two completely different narratives for this character, but he goes, they're both valid in the film. From the film standpoint, it doesn't really matter. You don't know, and as the observer, you never will, and you can simply read it both ways, and that both of those narratives are valid. And the same thing is true for a lot of historical opinion and argument. You can come up with narratives, and they're both valid, but they can't both be, but they're actually describing different realities. And I think what it comes down to is that what really happened, you don't know, and you never will know. Because we never really get this, everything recorded is just this, you remember some things and you don't remember other ones. Two people at the same event, seemingly looking at the same thing, will never give you exactly the same version of it. And another thing to keep in mind is that wherever you are, whatever it is you're looking at, you only ever see half of it because you can't see what's happening behind you. A person facing in the opposite direction will have a completely different view of that reality, the reality of that experience, than you will. So there is never, at any given time, any reality. It's simply based upon the individual realities and perceptions and comparing those. And if you talk, if you and your friend who are both at a place later get together and compare notes and you don't agree, one of those they're both equally valid, and yet they're both contradictory. There is no original story. Whatever happened just kind of happened, and people got glimpses of it, and you kind of put that together. So there's nothing to go back to. It's just based upon these imperfect perceptions of this. And then we take those and we combine them together, and you research and try to come up with more facts, and you embed them into a narrative, and you can make that narrative come out in different ways, and then that passes for history. And that's why most of it's bunk,
This is
because
my
most of
favorite.
what you're talking about really isn't true.
This is what
It
I
doesn't.
like about you most is this piece of how you see reality and the objective part of how you interpret it. And when I've heard you through different threads, this is why I really wanted to speak with you, because it's so important, this part of it. And it's so, I've heard you even say the history is so many ripples of unintended consequences that,
Unintended consequences.
yeah,
That's the great law that governs everything, because human beings do things and you think you're going to get a result. But when you change one variable, you change multiple variables that you didn't even know were there. And you never get the result that you want. And the same thing applies apply this again to something like MKUltra. Okay, you're trying to understand the architecture of the mind. You're performing experiments on people, and you're changing variables. But you may get some result that you hadn't anticipated. You may never get the result that you had before because you don't know the other things that you're changing when you do this. And in the same way, all of those tech wizards are out there trying to perform modern alchemical transformations. I guarantee you that they will never get exactly the results that they want because they don't know what they're dealing with. I think of it this way. You're trying to alter a reality, the nature of which you don't understand, that you can't even comprehend. It's that reality which is outside the movie in your head. You don't know what's going on out there. And you think that you can control this, But the only thing you here's the only thing you can control is the movie in your head. You cannot control the bigger realm outside of it. So I don't know. We live in a precarious environment. And one of the things I get accused of by people is that I'm just trying to confuse you. Well, yeah, because that's the state. That's the natural state of things. Uncertainty and confusion is the best you can actually come for. Kind of organized. The minute you think you got everything figured out, that this is the way, you know, you've gone down the path of the fool once you do that. I'm sorry, but that's, and it was, I probably mentioned I think when I was 17, I actually thought I had things pretty well figured out. uh, anyway, things seem to make sense. I could kind of figure that out, and it's just been a process of continual disillusionment from that point on. So no, uh, it, the world in some ways makes much less sense to me than it did earlier on. I mean, human beings do not they're just weird. Okay. Um, they're interesting but unpredictable. Events are interesting but unpredictable. Um, if I think back to 1968 when I was 17 and how things have evolved since then, nobody saw this coming. All right. I mean, there were supposed to be flying cars. That's what I was promised. Flying cars and jetpacks. Those have not materialized. Airplanes look exactly the same. Telephones have changed drastically. Who would have thought that? And one of these things, I have a deep, abiding suspicion of cell phones. Okay, from the beginning, I have one. I do not carry it around with me because I just don't. I miss telephone booths, but that's just me. But you know what? I first noticed this with students. I'd come up, and you come outside, waiting outside the classroom, and they'd all be sitting around. And it used to be people would be sitting around talking to each other, and then you'd come up, and they're all just staring at these things. Every single one of them. There's no conversation that's taking place. They're all just staring at these little light boxes in their hands like they're hypnotized, which they are. They're addicted to them. Cell phones are an addiction. And I know I'm getting kind of preachy, but anyway, they're an addiction. I also think that they're the substitute for cigarettes because that's what people used to do. They weren't doing anything. You pull out a cigarette, you light it. People, they gave people something to do with their hands. You always got a cigarette in your hand. You got the lighter. People would play with their lighters, and now they don't have that. And now they've just got these little auxiliary brains that they carry around with them.
Yeah.
And that really, I think that's creepy.
Yeah, and they're
Okay, it's just
engineered. They're
it's creepy.
engineered for addiction for sure. I've
It,
heard
it
from.
it is it's a dopamine. Everything getting something. And I'm not immune to that. It's the closest. It's why I tend to avoid social media. I don't. I'm just not that sociable person. I mean, I don't know. I can talk to people without this,
Yeah.
and I don't need all this managing things and sending out tweets. That's way too much work. I'm too lazy for that. But um, it's just this. Email is about the most I have. But I don't know. If I hear the little bing that goes off that you got something in the inbox, I have this insatiable urge to go over and check and see what it is. It's probably nothing, but you go there because you get this little rush and you think you'll get something else. But I know at that moment that I'm just like a goat at a petting zoo, that I've just been programmed to respond to this noise, and then I'll go and respond to something. And when you're consciously aware of that and you have a hard time fighting it, you know, maybe it's just easier to surrender and go with the flow. But no, I'm not immune, which is
Well,
why I know it's there.
I appreciate, after all these years of being a historian, the perspective of the more you know, the more you don't know, and the humility factor and the comedy element to it. Because if you start to take this thing too seriously, I've heard Terence McKenna once say, he said, we just don't know enough to worry. And we don't even know what reality is and all this stuff. And I love that thread because I like to think of the fact that something's happening from nothing. And you should be sort of lucky and grateful that you're having an experience. And then don't get too swept into any one type of ideological path because then you're stuck and you know it's just not true. So I do like what your thread is. And I don't know if you've ever read or come across Robert Anton Wilson much.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He
I
was
can't
always
say
sort of
I didn't read him at the time, but yes, I'm all
raw.
too
He was
aware of him. Yeah.
just sort of funny and comical, but brilliant at the same time. And he was always just leading you back to this more and more confusion. And once you think you've got it figured out, you know you're duped.
Yes, that's when you've gone off the deep end, when you've got something that but that's the role that ideology plays, and dare I say religion plays in a lot of cases, because it provides you with a model of reality that usually the people on the outside of it doesn't make any sense. It's I keep bringing up this a lot lately, but it comes into this idea: is why people join cults. And that goes back to my interest before. My interest in secret societies isn't because I desperately want to belong to a secret society. I don't really like that kind of idea, because to me it just looks like I get in there and there are a bunch of rules I have to follow, and someone's going to start telling me what to do. I don't want anything to do with that. But but what intrigues me about it is I don't know why people do. I mean, what's the attraction to this? Why do you do it? And the most extreme form, I guess, is when we join what we call a cult. And so I can relate this experience. I went to grad school in Santa Barbara, and there were probably more than one cult there, but there was a particular cult, a kind of offshoot of theosophy. It somehow got its basis in yoga, and then it went from there and ended up with Lemurians. I don't know how that worked. Um, but it was what is the Brotherhood of the Sun, and it was run by this guy who was a yoga teacher who eventually then attracted a bunch of people who met in his trailer, and then it expanded from there, and then it became this whole kind of expanding business enterprise and farms and inevitably stores of weapons for the apocalypse, because that's always going to come along. I don't know what is with these groups. They get together and now there's going to be an apocalypse and we have to begin storing weapons. But the other thing about it was that you had to give your transfer your material possessions, which were corrupting you, to the church, to him. You were just giving all your money and stuff. And I knew there were a couple, and I didn't know them that well, but I knew them well enough to have the conversation about, yes, yeah, we've sold our car, and my wife has this trust fund, and we're all transferring it over to Norm. And that was the goofiest thing I'd ever heard of. And the only thing that I could sort of think of to say is, what the hell's the matter with you? I mean, have you gone crazy? Because that's what it seemed like. And keep in mind, these were, on the other hand, university graduate students. Okay, the thing about a lot of people that join cults is that they're overeducated. I mean, they're not stupid in any conventional sense, and they're not ignorant, at least in terms. Supposedly they would know better, but I can guarantee you that's not true. Okay. Academia is not full of people who have good touch with reality. That's why most of them are in academia, because they can't deal with reality. There is
Yeah.
an ivory tower thing there. And again, I'm not totally accepting myself from that, but I can tell you that's what's going on there. Um, and I just I couldn't fathom why you would do something like that, because it just seemed to be. And this was, I think, where I first sort of encountered that people can just be kind of selectively insane, that otherwise they seem to be quite, they can hold a job, balance a checkbook, drive a car, they can do all of these things, raise children, but then they just give all of their material belongings to some guy who's promised them something, some sort of spiritual enlightenment, and essentially assign themselves over to slavery. I mean, to me, that's a form of, if anything, madness. And yet they're not mad otherwise. So I think that's also one of the things that that's unpredictable about people, because if you know anyone long enough and well enough, you'll probably eventually enter their crazy zone. You'll find the thing that was it Churchill or somebody once said that everybody's a little mad about something,
Yeah.
and I think that's true. There's some sort of crazy some point where the rational thought just stops, and people have now created this kind of narrative for themselves that seems to be very, very important. So that's always one of those things to look for in friends, especially roommates. Okay, a lot of people have had that experience. They seem perfectly normal at first. Okay, it's only after a few weeks with living with them that you figure out that this person is crazy.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it seems like the colleges and the more institutionalized you get, the more obedient, compliant, and because we build it on test scores and it's a matter of memorization and it's not on free thinking and questioning authority. So it seems to rhyme that when you go into these institutions for a longer period of time, it almost handicaps your capacity to be a free thinking individual if there's anything underlying that. But anyway, I love this, and I could probably talk to you for hours, but we are at the 2 hour mark, and I know you said that that's our cap. But I have
Yeah.
a question that's important, and I
Okay.
think if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
What would I want to share? Well, that's an interesting question. Well, I say it goes back to something you mentioned before, is that observe everything. Okay, pay attention to what's going on, and I mean even pay attention to little things that happen. There's supposedly a kind of a cultish saying that you know there are no coincidences and there are no accidents. Everything that happens is an omen. Everything is in some way predictive of something else. Now that's wouldn't go that far, but pay attention. But on the other hand, don't take it too seriously. Don't get caught up into. Don't start trying to create a narrative. Just let it happen. Let things happen. And it was, in fact, someone just the other day was asking me, in terms of sort of career, and I had a career that turned out pretty well. Okay, but was this because I had some sort of plan? Okay. To the extent that I ever had a plan, it never worked. What did work was apparently just letting the things that happen. And the pivotal elements in my life weren't something that I planned. They were just things that Providence plopped down in front of me, either to take advantage of or to avoid. And that's pretty much what guided it. And it worked out okay. I don't know. Would it have worked out better if I'd put more active effort into it? Well, like I said, I'm kind of lazy, I guess. Or maybe I just figured out that, just don't try to force things to a conclusion. Consider everything that has been said. Don't embrace it as absolute truth. Let what's going to happen, because it's going to do it anyway. There's nothing you can do about it. Right? In the same way that you can't do anything about where you were born or the family you were born into. You can't change any of those things. You can't control much of anything else. So just experience life as a great, interesting, multifaceted narration that you're just here to observe for a certain amount of time, and I don't know, maybe learn something or not. Doesn't matter. You either will or you won't. There you go.
That's beautiful. I really like that a lot, actually. That's
Whatever.
an amazing way to approach life, I think. So that's a nugget. I really appreciate that.
Okay, there's my wisdom.
Cool.
All right.
Awesome. But I really appreciate your time, and I'll make sure I refer everybody to your work.
Yeah, one thing I could add to that is that I'm actually trying to. A friend and I are doing our very amateurish podcast. So it is called Strange as It Seems. There are episodes posted up on Spotify, and there's some of those being transferred over to YouTube. So if you're interested, tune in, and we'll see whether or not we're wasting our time.
Perfect. I'll make sure I send people to your work. That'll be cool, and I'll check it out myself.
Okay.
Right
Well,
on.
thanks for having
Thank
me
you.
on.
Thank you. That was fun. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.